It was a bitterly cold Cape Town night on December 3, 2001, the kind of wind that slipped under doorways and whispered through the corridors of even the wealthiest homes. In the affluent Dolphin Beach complex nestled along the Blouberg coastline, everything seemed undisturbed. The guarded gates, patrolling security, and ocean view apartments painted the illusion of complete safety. But behind the locked door of apartment 7B, something unspeakably brutal was unfolding. Marike de Klerk, former First Lady of South Africa, ex-wife to former President F.W. de Klerk, had retreated into a quiet, private life after her divorce. Still admired by many for her poise and resilience during South Africa's tumultuous political transformation, she had chosen this beachfront haven for its tranquility. But for all the beauty it promised, that night would become a grotesque contradiction of peace. Earlier that evening, 21-year-old Luyanda Mboniswa clocked in for his shift at the very complex where Marike resided. Young, unassuming, and hired to uphold the safety of the estate, Mboniswa blended into the background of luxury living. No alarms were raised as he passed familiar corridors. No suspicion lingered in the air as he surveyed the halls. But within him, something had curdled, a festering anger or impulse that defied sense or morality. What was about to occur would not only shock a nation but desecrate the illusion of security within its wealthiest walls. At some point during his shift, Mboniswa approached Marike's apartment. Whether she let him involuntarily, or he forced his way inside, remains unclear. But what happened once the door closed was savagery beyond comprehension. In what must have been minutes of confusion and terror, the man tasked with protecting her became her executioner. He gripped her throat with a violence reserved for the most unrepentant monsters. Bones fractured under the pressure of his hands, an anatomical betrayal echoing through the fragile framework of her neck. The force ruptured a blood vessel in her eye, leaving it red with a final, silent scream. Her airway collapsed, her breath stolen, and her body caught in a losing war for survival. As if that brutality weren't enough, he retrieved a steak knife, common, domestic, insignificant in most hands. But in his, it became an instrument of horror. He drove the blade into her back, embedding it so deeply that it remained lodged in place, a silent witness to what he'd done. The coroner would later catalogue additional head injuries, deep and deliberate, suggesting either extreme rage or cold calculation. Or both. The scene he left behind was an unholy stillness. Blood smeared the floors, the walls, her body. And then, just like that, he was gone, out the same door he had entered, back into his uniformed disguise, once more the quiet security guard beneath the soft yellow lights of the complex. When authorities discovered her body, the initial reports suggested suicide. It was a lie born of disbelief. Perhaps no one could imagine such violence touching someone of her stature. But that theory crumbled quickly under the weight of evidence: shattered cartilage in her throat, defensive wounds, the knife. This had not been the end of a woman choosing her exit, it had been a murder, deliberate and monstrous. News broke quickly. A nation watched in horror as headlines clashed with the image of the poised woman who had once stood beside the last apartheid-era president. Her ex-husband, F.W. de Klerk, was in Stockholm at the time, attending a centennial celebration of the Nobel Peace Prize, a prize he had once shared with Nelson Mandela. He returned swiftly, shaken, to face a press corps hungry for answers. "I have learned with great shock and sorrow of the circumstances of the tragic death of my former wife," he said, his words flat, rehearsed, or perhaps emptied by grief. Others, though, spoke with raw honesty. Winnie Madikizela Mandela, standing before mourners in Pretoria, delivered a eulogy that transcended politics. "As a woman," she said, her voice steady and piercing, "I identify with the exhaustion of her emotional resources in helping to shape her husband's career." That sentence echoed like a thunderclap, a shared understanding between women who had lived in the shadow of power, propping up the ambitions of men while sacrificing pieces of themselves. Marike de Klerk was mourned, buried, and slowly, the world turned its attention elsewhere. But behind the scenes, investigators worked relentlessly to find her killer. They combed through surveillance footage, questioned staff, and followed every possible lead. The more they dug, the more one name emerged from the shadows: Luyanda Mboniswa. He wasn't just a disgruntled employee. He had previous disciplinary issues, minor infractions that painted a portrait of a man capable of escalation. And when confronted, cracks in his story began to show. Within weeks, law enforcement had enough to arrest him. What followed was a trial that re-exposed the ugly details: each wound, each cry, each strike of the knife replayed in clinical, heartless language. But it was important. The truth had to be told. He was acquitted of rape. The charge had hung heavy over the case, but without conclusive forensic evidence, the court couldn't confirm it. Still, a chilling detail clung to the trial: though a pathologist couldn't confirm penetration, neither could they rule it out. The court ultimately convicted Mboniswa of murder. Life imprisonment followed. And for a long time, the case seemed closed, justice seemingly served, albeit delayed. But time moves. South Africa changes. Memory fades. And after 22 years behind bars, in a moment many believed would never come, Luyanda Mboniswa was quietly granted parole. What did freedom feel like to a man who had stolen it so violently from another? The answer was locked in his silence. But for the family and friends of Marike de Klerk, the pain had never left. It lived in the images of her final moments, in the forensic photos, and in the echoing emptiness of a home where safety had been fatally betrayed. The death of Marike de Klerk did not end when her body was sealed inside a casket. It rippled outward, through the quiet halls of Dolphin Beach, into the hearts of her children, across the news cycles of a nation still struggling with its own identity. Behind every sympathetic headline, however, there was a chilling truth: someone had looked Marike in the eye and extinguished her life without hesitation. The autopsy was clinical. Distant. It described her body like it was a broken object. But it couldn't mask the violence. Her hyoid bone, delicate and horseshoe-shaped, was snapped in two. Her larynx crushed. Her eye revealed the telltale burst of blood, a sign that the strangulation wasn't brief. It had been prolonged, sustained. As if Mboniswa had wanted her to feel the end coming, second by excruciating second. She hadn't been found immediately. For hours, perhaps longer, she lay cold and alone in her flat, face turned toward the floor, knife jutting from her back, blood congealing beneath her body. The scene was catastrophic. Her skull bore the imprint of multiple blunt impacts, and her arms were peppered with bruises in defensive patterns. She had fought, but she hadn't stood a chance. Investigators entered the apartment with cameras and gloves, trying to remain professional amid the horror. Nothing appeared stolen. No valuables missing. No forced entry. It wasn't a robbery gone wrong. This was personal. The evidence didn't whisper, it screamed. Whoever had killed her wanted her silent. Permanently. Suspicion turned inward fast. In a high-security building like Dolphin Beach, access was monitored. Residents had keycards. Staff had logs. Surveillance footage, though grainy, told part of the story. It showed Mboniswa on the floor near her apartment at a time he shouldn't have been there. When questioned, his explanations didn't hold. He stammered. He redirected. But it was too late. Forensics began to unravel his mask. His DNA was found beneath her fingernails. She had clawed at him in her final moments. Blood spatter analysis placed him in the room during the attack. And a partial print, his, was recovered from the knife handle, smeared but unmistakable. Once arrested, Luyanda Mboniswa didn't confess. He didn't cry. He didn't show emotion at all. He stared through the police like they were furniture. During trial, his attorneys tried to cast doubt. They said the evidence was circumstantial. That perhaps someone else had used his uniform. But the jury saw the truth written into every inch of Marike's battered body. Still, the specter of sexual assault hovered over the proceedings. The rape charge could not be definitively proven. The pathologist said there was trauma, but not enough for certainty. For Marike's family, that unresolved ambiguity was another wound. If there had been such an assault, it meant Mboniswa hadn't just killed her, he'd defiled her. Every day in court reopened the nightmare. Photographs of the crime scene were shown, projected on a large screen as the audience tried not to look away. There was no dignity left in how she died. And yet, showing those images was necessary. They told the story her voice could not. After weeks of testimony, Mboniswa was found guilty of murder. The judge's voice was flat as he handed down the sentence, life imprisonment. The word life sounded absolute. Final. But that illusion would one day shatter. For the moment, though, South Africa exhaled. The killer of Marike de Klerk was behind bars. In the years that followed, Marike became a symbol of violence against women, of failed safety systems, of the thin line between privilege and danger. Her former life as First Lady was quietly folded into memory, but her final moments refused to disappear. Activists invoked her name. Politicians cited her death when speaking of reform. But in private, her children mourned not a symbol, but a mother. Mboniswa disappeared from public view. Prison swallowed him. For 2 decades, he rotted in a cell, no longer a predator but a number. He filed appeals. They failed. He requested transfers. They were denied. He faded into obscurity, the way killers often do when time erodes their headlines. But time also wears down justice. In 2023, whispers began. A parole review. A reassessment of his behavior in prison. Officials cited his rehabilitation, his participation in anger management courses, his clean conduct record. Paperwork was filed. Signatures collected. Bureaucracy clicked into place like a slow, grinding lock. And then, just like that, he was free. After serving 22 years, the the man who had strangled, stabbed, and bludgeoned Marike de Klerk was quietly released back into society. There was no public statement. No televised apology. No admission of guilt. He simply vanished. The announcement came as a cold slap to those who remembered her. Her name was resurrected not in tribute, but in protest. Her family learned the news not in a courtroom, but through the press. Once again, her death was public property. What remained of Marike's legacy was stained with outrage. How could her killer be allowed to walk the same streets she once did? What did life imprisonment mean if it could be reduced to just over 2 decades? The luxury complex where she was murdered has since changed hands. New residents occupy the apartment where she drew her last breath. The tiles have been replaced. The walls repainted. But beneath that cosmetic renewal, a violent history lingers. There is something chilling in the knowledge that monsters do not always come from dark alleyways. Sometimes, they wear uniforms. Sometimes, they carry radios. Sometimes, they are trusted with keys. Mboniswa was not a shadowy intruder. He didn't slip through a broken window or skulk down back staircases. He walked through the front door, wearing the badge of authority, and left behind carnage so profound it defied logic. The system that allowed him into her life was the same one that later claimed to protect the rest of society from him. Twice, it failed. And now, he is out there again, older, quieter, and unrepentant. No one can say what he sees when he looks in the mirror. But for those who knew Marike, they see only one thing, the face of a man who took everything from her. There are some deaths that slip quietly into memory. Marike de Klerk's wasn't one of them. Her murder wasn't just violent, it was symbolic. A woman once draped in the quiet dignity of a first lady, reduced to a headline soaked in blood. But beyond the brutality, something deeper stirred beneath the surface. Something that never quite added up. In the weeks after the killing, there was confusion, too much of it. The first report released to the public suggested suicide. The authorities hinted that Marike may have taken her own life, despite the unmistakable presence of a steak knife driven into her back. A seasoned politician's wife, ending her life in a storm of self-inflicted trauma? The absurdity was almost insulting. Why the hesitation? Why the need to shape the narrative before facts had a chance to breathe? When the truth emerged, it wasn't just the brutality that shocked the nation, it was the realization that the system had tried, even briefly, to bury it. Her voice was silenced in death, and her story nearly distorted by those charged with revealing it. There were whispers. Low, cautious voices in backrooms of government buildings. Marike had enemies, some said, not personal enemies, but ideological ones. Her stance on social issues, her outspoken criticism of crime in post-apartheid South Africa, had placed her in a delicate space. She'd spoken publicly about leadership failure. She'd challenged the very political order that had once protected her. Some questioned how a young man like Mboniswa, with a documented history of misconduct and an incomplete security clearance, had landed a position at one of Cape Town's most elite residential complexes. Was it negligence? Or was it something else? When officials were asked about the vetting process, their answers were vague. Background checks had supposedly been completed. References verified. But no documentation was ever made public. One curious detail emerged: the company responsible for staffing the complex quietly dissolved a year after Marike's death. No interviews. No lawsuits. Just a vanishing act. It raised uncomfortable questions. Had Mboniswa been placed there deliberately? Was he a lone predator, or a pawn in something larger, something unspoken? While the courts dealt in evidence, the streets dealt in speculation. Marike's murder became a symbol of something broken, something rotting beneath the polished surface of a still young democracy. Even more chilling was the fact that she'd reportedly told a close friend, just weeks before her death, that she didn't feel safe in her home. That she felt watched. Followed. She had been considering moving, had even asked about personal security options. Those words, once brushed off as nerves, now felt like a prophecy. But perhaps the most haunting detail came not from the trial, or the police files, but from a short, overlooked line in a pathology report. Marike was likely conscious during most of her assault. She had seen her killer's face. Known him. Perhaps even pleaded with him. The silence that followed her death was thunderous. Politicians issued statements. Tributes were paid. But beneath the scripted condolences, there lingered an unease, like a nation watching a curtain fall too quickly. When her funeral was held in Pretoria, it drew more attention than any public event since the Truth and Reconciliation Commission hearings. But even in death, Marike stirred conflict. Winnie Madikizela Mandela attended the funeral in person, skipping that of revered ANC leader Joe Modise. Her presence was not subtle, it was a statement. As a woman, she said, her voice resolute, I identify with the exhaustion of her emotional resources. It wasn't a political eulogy. It was personal. Raw. And for many, it gave Marike something the courts could not: her humanity. Despite the noise, one fact stood firm: Mboniswa was found guilty and imprisoned for life. Or so the country believed. The idea of life imprisonment brought momentary comfort. But time erodes all things, including the illusion of permanence. As the years passed, attention drifted. Other crimes took the spotlight. South Africa moved on. Marike's memory stayed trapped in the minds of a grieving family, while the rest of the nation slowly forgot. Then came the final betrayal. In 2023, under a blanket of bureaucratic silence, parole was granted to Luyanda Mboniswa. After just 22 years, the man who strangled, stabbed, and bludgeoned a woman to death was quietly released from prison. There was no public hearing. No press statement. The Justice Department offered a standard response: the inmate met all requirements for parole and demonstrated signs of rehabilitation. The same system that had once failed to screen him as a guard had now deemed him safe to walk among the public. The announcement hit Marike's family like a second death. Her children, grown now, had been given no warning. They found out from the news. To them, justice hadn't just failed. It had collapsed. And so, the question remains: who protects the memory of the murdered when systems refuse to? When apologies are vague and accountability fades into the fog of time, what does justice really mean? Dolphin Beach still stands, its luxury units shining in the Cape Town sun, unaware, or uncaring, of the terror once sown into its foundation. Families move in and out. The walls are repainted. The carpet replaced. But the floorboards know. The air still remembers the final, desperate gasp of a woman who once lived a life of quiet poise and unflinching courage. Marike de Klerk didn't die in obscurity. She was silenced by violence, buried by bureaucracy, and forgotten by design. But her story remains a warning, a flickering siren in the minds of those who dare to believe that security, power, or privilege are enough to keep darkness at bay. Her killer walks free. Her voice does not. But her silence, deafening as it is, still speaks volumes. Thank you for listening to Crime Echoes with Lewis. Please like this video and subscribe for more content like this.